All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for the shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, to thank Jordan and Shishi Ehrenfeld for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this month. L'zeich Nishmas, their grandfather Yosef ben Shmuel Aaron, Benjamin and Elise Wall of Netanya, for dedicating the Shurim this month in memory of their dear friend and mentor Moshe Chaim ben Tzvi Hirsch. Our week of learning sponsors, Hillel Alani Goldman, with appreciation and honor of Dr. and Mrs. Jacob and Goldie Milner, and appreciation of the entire Kehila. Ari and Haley Lichterman, Le'iloi Nishmas, Haley's mother, Rachel Leah Bas Ruvain Mayor. We open on the merit of our Talmud Torah. All of the neshamas will have an aliyah in the families in Chama. We also have an additional sponsorship. This is Kathy Pollack, our share member. Paul Pollack is having eye surgery today. Paul is a staple of this, a staple and a pillar of this shir. So we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah. So Paul Pesach ben Shmuel will have a refuah shalema and a successful surgery. We look forward to welcoming him back to the shir Bekarov. But so with that, let us begin. So we have, Baruch Hashem, a lot to do today. We are up to, today's daf is Nun Zayin, but we're actually starting on Nun Vav Amud Beis, and we are picking up, it's easier to count from the top of the page down, sorry about that, so we are picking up with Amar Rava. Let's pick up from there, Amar Rava. So it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14 lines down from the top. Amar Rava. So we'll say again, Sugya will flow relatively quickly. So Amar Rava, we actually began this yesterday, but let's have another critical look at it today. So Amar Rava, Eishes Kohen Shenansa, if the wife of a Kohen was violated by another man, so Baila Lokela Mishum Zona. Ultimately, again, so remember, we've established in yesterday's daf that when the wife of a Kohen is violated, she is no longer permitted to her husband. Not only that, says the Gemara, but if the husband continues to live with her, then halacha lamaisa, he is loke mishum zona. Ultimately, again, it's like having relations. So again, if you look at Rashi, baila loke la mishum zona, the chsiv zona lo yikach. The Torah says that a Kohen is not permitted to marry a zona. Now, the halachic definition of a zona, we will, Emirat Hashem, get to as part of today's daf. What the Gemara is saying is not only is the Kohen not permitted to live with his wife, who was violated, but if he does so, he himself is in violation of having relations with a zona. So the Gemara says, one second, Mishum zona in, Mishum tuma lo, only because of zona, but not because of tuma. Now, what's the tumah that they're referring to over here? Take a look at Rashi again. Mishum tumah lo, betmiya, hamina parakamon, hamani mekayim, acharei asher hutama, the rabbos sota shnivala dirsiv lo yucha baila. So both say, there is a concept of tumah. The concept of tumah the Gemara refers to over here is after a woman has engaged in an illicit relationship, or an illegal, I shouldn't say illicit, illegal relationship, living with her subsequently is a form of Tumah. So the Gemara says, after the Kohen's wife was with someone who she's not allowed to be with, albeit against her will, isn't there an issue of Tumah as well? To which the Gemara says, Ema af mishum zona. It means also because of zona. So the Gemara is saying, Enachinami, there are two issues for the Kohen over here. One is an issue of zona, and one is the issue of acharei asher hutama. After she has become defiled by being with another man, there's also an issue of Tumah. Or I should say there's an issue of Tumah, and there's also an issue of Zona. So Master Rabbi Zera says, one second, let's analyze. V'hilon is pasa asura. So both say, the pasuk over here is referring to a woman who has relations with another man. Married woman who has relations with another man. So the Torah says, V'shachav ish osa, shichvas zara, v'ne'ala me'ene isha v'nistera, v'hi nitma'a ve'in eidba v'hi lo nispasa. So our Torah speaks about a case over here where halacha lamaisa, a married woman has relations with another man, and she was not forced. She was not coerced, right? In that case, that's adultery, and she's asura to her husband. Now, what we infer from that is hanit basa mutares. That tells us that if a woman is violated against her will, she remains permitted to her husband. Now, that is talking about a regular case of a Yisrael. Regular case of a Yisrael man married to a woman, his wife is chas v'shalom violated by someone else, she remains permitted to him. But there is another situation, where even if the woman is violated against her will, she becomes prohibited to her husband ve'ezo zu, right? Ve'eza, and which case is that? Zu eshes Kohen. This is the wife of a Kohen, where halacha l'maisa, even though she is violated, she becomes prohibited to her husband. And the Gemara says, "Valav haba mechlal aseh aseh." Here's the problem. We'll say, in other words, that is a lav that is learned out from an aseh, vehi lo nisbasa. So it's a lav, it's a prohibition that's learned out from a positive commandment. A prohibition learned out from a positive commandment is in and of itself a positive commandment in aseh. Amar Rabba, and Rabba says, no. Hakol hayu bichlal zona. Originally, I will say, what does it mean everyone was included in the klal of zona? I will say, this is incredibly important. What the Gemara is coming up over here is with a definition. See, I will say, we often think of the word zona as a woman who goes ahead and engages in willful immoral conduct. What we're going to see is that the halachic definition of a zona is a woman who has relations with any man with whom she cannot affect kiddushin. That's the definition of a zona. So originally, all these situations, willful, unwillful, if a woman had relations with a man with whom she cannot affect kiddushin, she becomes a zona. So what happens? Zona. But then I will say the Torah pulled out one of these situations. Which situation did it pull out? A woman who was violated. A woman who was violated. And told us that Allah, a woman who was violated is not called the zona, and she is muteres to her husband. Mechlal de'eshes kohen kaima kaima. I will say the only woman it pulls out is the wife of a Yisrael. But the wife of a Kohen remains in that category of a zona. Vikadamri, others explain, Amar Rabba, Ishes Kohen Shenensa, by the local Mishum Tuma. But an alternate version of the previous discussion. Rabba said, the wife of a Kohen who's violated, if her husband continues to live with her, he gets malchus for Tuma. Acharei asher hu tama, Pasuk says, after the woman becomes defiled, she's no longer permitted to her husband. If he continues to go ahead and live with her, he gets malchus, to which the Gemara says, Mishum tuma in, Mishum zona lo. We can infer from that he only gets malchus because of tuma, not because of zona, to which the Gemara says, the alma ba'ones lo karina bezona. What do you see from here? It must be that in a case of ones, where she's violated, we don't call her, she doesn't fall into the category of zona. Masib Rabbi Zera v'hinlonis basasura. Rabbi Zera raises the kasha. We'll say it's the same conversation, just a different slant. The pasuk says if she was not coerced, that's when she's asura. Hanis basamuteres. What do we infer from that? That Allah Chalamaisa, if she was coerced, she would be permitted to her husband. That's talking about by Yisrael. But there's another case where even if the woman was coerced, she becomes asura to her husband, ve'ezo, and which case is that? Eshes Kohen. This is the wife of a Kohen. But 1 second, at most, that makes it an asay, not a los asay. So why would he get malchus? After all, this is a lav that is learned out from a positive commandment. Amar Rava, once again, Rava says, Hakol hayu bichlal acharei asher hu tama. All women, I will say, who had relations with a man who was prohibited to them are included in this phrase or in this lav of acharei asher hu tama, which sounds like if you have relations with a man who you are prohibited to, ultimately, again, there is a sense of defilement, and that defilement makes you prohibited to your husband. But then the Torah goes in and tells us, but there is a case that's an exception to that, and the case is where the wife of Yisrael was violated against her will, harnispasa, but ultimately again, if it was willful, right? If it was against her will, there was coercion, mutaras, she'd be permitted. Mechal deishes koin kide kaima kaima. So we'll say essentially, interesting enough, what the construct does is as follows. The phrase of acharei asher hu tama teaches us that if a woman has relations with a man whom she is prohibited to, she becomes defiled, and as a result, unable to continue to live with her husband. The Torah then goes in and gives us an exception to that rule. What's the exception to that rule? Vehi lo nispasa. She was not coerced, which indicates to us that if there was coercion, then Allah Chalamaisa, she remains permitted to her husband. That's the exception to the acharei asher hu tama rule. But ultimately, who does that exception apply to? It only applies to the wife of Yisrael, doesn't apply to the wife of the Kohen. I will say this Gemara yields a very important halachic principle. So I will say, like I said before, when we look at the word zona, we look at zona as an immoral woman. right? A woman who willfully engages in acts of immorality. What the Gemara says is actually that category of zona is much more expansive. And what that category of zona refers to is any woman who has relations with a man with whom she cannot affect kiddushin. In fact, the Rambam in Hilchos Isurei Bia, Perek Yurches Halacha Aleph highlights this. Listen to what he writes. Umipia Shmuel Lamadnu, Shazona Ha'amura B'Torah, Hikol Shena Bas Yisrael, O Bas Yisrael Shenivala La'adam, Shi Asura Lihinase Lo Isser Hashave Bakol. I will say, the definition of a zona is any woman who cannot affect kiddushin with the man who she is having relations with. Now, said, let me give you like a crazy example of this. Rambam brings this down. Let's say a woman, right? A woman in a Kohen is not permitted to marry a zona. Let's say a woman engages in bestiality. Is she a zona? Is she a zona? The Rambam says no. Why? Because ultimately, again, he says, zona. I will say, at the end of the day, you only become a zona if you have relations with someone who's not, you can't affect kiddushin with. But an animal, for example, is totally out of the parsha of kiddushin. Another example, another interesting example. Let's say a woman goes ahead and has relations with, Rambam gives examples of this. Let's say a woman, let me give you other examples. I'm sorry. I will say, let's say, for example, now this is talking about a person whom she cannot affect kiddushin with, but is in the parsha of kiddushin. Let's say a woman goes ahead and has relations with a non-Jew. Does that render her a zona? According to the Rambam, the answer to that would be no. See, interestingly enough, but let's say, so again, without getting into the technical cases, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara gives us a much more expansive definition of zona. And zona effectively means any woman who has relations with a man with whom she cannot affect kiddushin. That's why when the wife of a Kohen is even violated by someone else, she technically has had relations with a man with whom she cannot affect kiddushin. Why can't she affect kiddushin with the man who violated her? Why not? Because she's married. Now I will say it's a technicality, but it renders her a zona. But again, the term zona seems so illicit. Obviously, in this context, it's not being used in an illicit way, it's being used in a technical way. And that indeed is halacha l'maisa. And I will say Mishnah. Continuing along in this same theme, an interesting case. Amar lekohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza lekohen hedyot. The boss say, here we go. Let's say a kohen marries an almana. Kohen marry illegal. Kohen's not allowed to marry an almana. Or grusha v'chalutza marries a or kohen hedyot marries a grusha v'chalutza. Suppose say these are all illegal marriages. So I will say, now here's the interesting shaila. I will say, imagine for a moment these women who are coming into these marriages themselves are bas kohanim, right? They're bas, right? They're a daughter of a kohen, which means they're eating truma. So we'll say, let's just play this out. Rachel is an almana. So after she was widowed, she's eating truma again from her father's home. Now she's read the shidduch to Ruvain, the kohen gadol. Okay, right? Sounds like a great shidduch. Only one problem, which is it's illegal, right? Only tech small issue. It's illegal. Now we'll say, so what happens? Ruvain, the kohen gadol, does erisin with her. Not nisuin, gives her a pruta, hariat mikudesh asli bepruta zu. Gives her kiddushin. Or again, the case of Rachel, the divorcee, right, who's also eating truma in her father's home, right, who goes in now and does erisin with another kohen. So we'll say, what's the shaila? Does illegal erisin prevent Rachel from eating truma anymore? Do we say that since she's entered into an illegal relationship, albeit only erisin, not nisuin, but erisin itself will preclude her from going ahead and eating truma? So we'll say fundamental machlokes. So here we go. So lo yochlu b'truma. So the Tanakama, which is going to be Rabbi Meir, holds that halacha l'maisa, once there is an illegal erisin, ultimately again she can no longer go ahead and eat truma. Look at Rashi. Mina eres and lo yochlu b'truma. Mishashin is kachu le'elu kidushi avera nifsala milecha b'truma debeinasha in bas koinu. Now, I'll say the moment, according to Rabbi Meir, the moment you go ahead and you enter into an illegal relationship, you are no longer permitted to go ahead and eat truma. Says the Gemara. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon machshirin. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say, no, you're permitted. Rabbi say, look at Rashi, Machshirin, Acheti Balo V'Taseh Chalala. K'dichsib lo yichalel shnei chilun echalav echad. Rabbi say, Rabbi Eliezer, or Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon hold, you're permitted to eat truma until when? Until there's bia. Until there's bia. We'll say, remember, when a woman has an illegal relationship with a Kohen, she becomes a halala. But they posit she only becomes a halala when? After bia. Again, everyone agrees she only becomes a halala after bia. So Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon will say she could eat truma even though she's had an illegal erusin, because she only becomes a halala who is precluded from consuming truma after bia. After bia, nis armalu o nis karshumina nisuan psulos. I'm saying, if halacha lemaisa, they become an almana, right? Nis armalu o nis karshu became an almana, or ultimately again went ahead and got divorced, if it happened min hanisuin psulos. So I will say, if these women were divorced or widowed from the suin, which means they had bia with the Kohen Hedyot or the Kohen Gadol, again illegal, halacha lemaisa psulos. Ultimately again they are halalos and therefore forever prohibited from marrying into the kahuna. However, mina erusin, if they were widowed or divorced from erusin, then ultimately again ksheros. Look at Rashi. Mina erusin ksheros. Afilu Rabbi Meir lo pasal mina erusin ela bechayehen demishtameres lebiyar. Both says it's very interesting. This is even according to Rabbi Meir. Even Rabbi Meir who holds that once there is erusin, these women can no longer eat truma, would agree that they only become chalalos after bia, and therefore again, if they are widowed from erusin, halacha lemaisa, they are permitted to go ahead and marry. They are permitted to go ahead and I should say they're ksheros. They're ksheros. So leave it like that. Says the Gemara. We'll say, so let's analyze. So we'll say fundamental machlokes. So again, once again, you have a bas kohen who is eating truma, right? Who is either widowed or divorced, who now marries a Kohen Gadol or Kohen Hedyot. Either way, it's an illegal marriage. They do erusin. The fundamental machlokes in the Mishnah is she permitted to go ahead and continue to eat truma or not? So Rabbi Meir says no. Once there is illegal erusin, you can no longer go. A woman cannot eat truma. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, once erusin, it's fine. She can continue to eat truma. Only once there's nisuin is she precluded from eating truma. Let's analyze. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Meir, Kal v'chomer. Rabbi Meir says in reality it's a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma kiddushei rishus in machilin kiddushei aver l'kol shekain. So Rabbi Meir will say like this. In a regular case of kiddushin, we established in yesterday's daf, let's say a legal marriage, kiddushin is not enough to allow a woman. Say a woman has kiddushin, stam woman has kiddushin with a kohen. So we say that Allah say after kiddushin you're not allowed to eat truma yet, only after nisuin. So in a case of regular kiddushin, you can't eat truma. So therefore, again, it makes sense to say that kiddushei aveira, you shouldn't be able to eat truma either. Amrulo. Im amr pekidushe rishus shekain elo lahachil b'makom acher. Here's Israel saying in the case of kiddushe rishus, regular kiddushin, kiddushe rishus, it never becomes permitted to go ahead and eat truma. Rabbi said kiddushe rishus is a case of a Yisrael who marries a regular woman. That kiddushin, right, that marriage will never create a license for truma consumption. So tomar b'kiddushe avera shekain yishol lahachil b'makom acher. The case of kiddushe avera ultimately again could allow for truma consumption in other circumstances. Amar Elazar Roshia, you're right. Pitzua Daka, Kohen Shekidish Bas Yisrael, Bana Lamachol Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, here we go. So we'll say, so the fundamental issue at play over here is as follows: that what happens halacha lamaisa when you have a situation where you know that the bia that is going to occur is going to go ahead and invalidate this woman. That's what's coming down the pike over here, right? The Kohen Gadol is mekadesh and almana. That is an illegal marriage. We know that bia will make this almana into a halala. So do we say that since we know she's what we call mishtameres labia psula. A bia psula is going to occur, that we go ahead and we essentially give her that puzzle status now and preclude her from eating truma, or we say no, she only becomes a psula when there's a bia. So we'll say that's the fundamental machlokes. So the Gemara says in reality there's another case. Listen to this. Facet. Ptsua daka, and both say who's a ptsua daka? Ptsua daka is a kohen, is a person with crushed testicles. Now the halacha of a ptsua daka is that a ptsua daka is not permitted to marry. We'll call it a regular Jewish woman. Now again, we'll discuss who he is permitted to marry, but in this case over here, you have a kohen who's a ptsua daka, who is Mekadesh Abbas Yisrael. Mekadesh, a regular woman. See, here we go, boss. Mekadesh, a regular woman. Says the Gemara, Banu Lamachlokis, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. What's the machlokis? Here we go. Rabbi Meir, Damar Mishtameres, Labia Psula, Da'oraisa, Lo Achla, Ha Nami Lo Achla. Boss, remember again, Rabbi Meir says, any time you're set up for a Bia Psula Da'oraisa, the woman already can't eat Truma from the time of Kiddushin, right? That's the case of the Mishnah. The Kohen Gadol marries an Almana. Let's say this Almana herself is a Bas Kohen. Since we know that there is a setup for a Bia Psula D'Oraisa, already that Psul begins by Kiddushin. Ptsua Daka is Mekadesh Abbas Yisrael, that is in a legal marriage. Ultimately, again, she can't eat Truma in that situation because Halacha Lamaisa, once again, she is set up for a Bia Psula D'Oraisa. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Dari Mishtamaris Bia Psula D'Oraisa Achla. But according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, they hold she could eat Truma until when? Until when she becomes a Halala. And when does she become a Halala? Only after Bia. Therefore, during Kiddushin, if she's a Bas Kohen, she could eat Truma. So too in this case where she's betrothed by a Ptsua Daka, ultimately she could eat Truma during Kiddushin. Top of Nun Zayin, Had Nami Achla. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe not. Mimai. How do you know to compare these two cases? Dilma'ad kano kami Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Hassam. Maybe Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon only hold their particular position in the Mishnah. Elad yesh lo lahachil b'makom acher. Because Rabbi say ultimately again, in the case of the Mishnah, Rabbi say there are permitted situations where this Kohen could allow a woman to eat Truma. Rabbi, remember again, for example, if the Kohen Gadol marries a Basula, there is a case where this marriage can enable Truma consumption. However, the Gemara says, "Hacha de'ein lo lech lahachel b'makom acher lo." Rabbi say, in this case of Ptsua Daka, is there ever a scenario where marriage to a Ptsua Daka allows for Truma consumption? And the answer is no. Not true that it's not totally true. We're going to see there is a case, but Lamai said the Gemara assumes right now he's not really permitted to marry anyone. Rabbi say, remember again, I want to point out, Ptsua Daka, from a marital perspective, has the same limitations effectively as a mamzer. He's not permitted to marry Bikal Hashem. Now we'll discuss who he can marry, but Lamai said the Gemara says the cases are not comparable. Maybe you'll say, 1 second. That's not true. There is a case of Ptsua Daka where he can allow, so he can marry someone else. So we'll say, when can he marry someone else? When can he marry someone? Bas Gerim. We'll say, in the case of the daughter of a convert. Take a look at Rashi, 3 lines down from the top. Bas Gerim. The kasavar kal Gerim lo ikri kahal. Ve'enon bichlal lo yavo Ptsua Daka. V'nosa beheter umachila v'truma. Rabbi, we're going to see an interesting case over here, that perhaps a Ptsua Daka is permitted to marry the daughter of a ger. Now, Rabbi say, now why could you marry the daughter of a ger? Because we're going to see a machlokes as to whether or not, the pasuk says, lo yavo b'kal Hashem. A Ptsua Daka is not permitted to come into the kal Hashem. We're going to see an opinion that says that kahal gerim is not called kal Hashem. Rabbi say, now what does that mean? Gerim are obviously full-fledged Jews and fully accepted into Klal Yisrael, but it's possible that they have a different type of communal designation. So when the pasuk says that you cannot marry into Kal Hashem, perhaps that doesn't include Kal Gerim, and let's say the Ptsua Daka can marry a Bas Gerim. He can marry a Bas Gerim. If that's the case, Rabbi say, then even Ptsua Daka has a case where through marriage he could allow a woman to eat Truma. I v'hami boile Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi say But this itself was a question of what the status of Kal Gerim is. Listen to this. So Rabbi Yochanan asked this question of Rabbi Oshia, Velo Pashit Le, and Rabbi Oshia himself did not answer it. So I will say, the status itself of a Bas Gerim in and of itself is a Shaila. Now I will say, now I want to point out, why is it Bas Gerim as opposed to Ger? Why can't it be Ger? Remember, a Kohen is not permitted to marry a Giores. Right? A Kohen is not permitted to marry a Giores. So again, at most, the way you could set this up, and even a Petzuadaka, which essentially, we're going to get to it now, we'll say that when a Kohen is a Petzuadaka, does he retain his Kedushas Kahuna or not? We're assuming for now that even though he's a Petzuadaka, and we'll say obviously as a Petzuadaka, what can't he do? He's not going to be able to do Avoda. He can't be a practicing Kohen. And Lamaisa, again, he's totally limited in his marriage pool, but he still retains his Kedushas Kahuna in that he still can't marry the women who a Kohen cannot marry. See, interestingly enough, to marry a Giores herself, that won't be permitted. But perhaps a Bas Gerim, if you hold that Kal Gerim lo Ikri Kal, we'll discuss that in just a moment, that perhaps a Petzuadaka can marry this woman. So let's analyze this. Here we go. Se'itmar, Abaye Amar Holu Ma'achila Below Yada. So let's listen to this. Abaye says as follows. Look at Rashi. Holu Ma'achila Below Yada. Look at Rashi. Almost right across a little bit further up. So Hayanasai Koin Isha, V'acheles Betruma, V'nase Betzuadaka. So I'll say, listen to the case over here. The case over here is a Kohen who's married to a woman, regular marriage, regular Kohen, married to a regular Bas Yisrael, right? And therefore, as a result of the marriage, she is permitted to eat Truma. Then what happens? V'nase Betzuadaka, then he becomes a Betzuadaka. So they're already married. He becomes a Petzuadaka. So I will say, what's the halacha? Uba aleha, if he has relations with her, once he has already become a Petzuadaka, lo tochal b'truma. I will say, at that point now, she can no longer eat truma. I will say, here's what's fascinating. So here's the case. Kohen marries a woman, regular healthy Kohen, regular Bas Yisrael, he marries her. Upon marriage, she is permitted to eat truma. Okay, he becomes a Petzuadaka. And Abba say, here's what's fascinating. If they don't have relations, she retains her license to eat truma. If he has relations with her, now suddenly she becomes prohibited to eat truma. Why is that? Rashi says. So Rashi says, the bala lotocha b'truma the shavya chalala. Because Rabbi say, once she has relations with a Petzuadaka, she becomes a halala. Once she becomes a halala, she becomes prohibited, even though she's having relations with her husband, but she's having relations ultimately again with a man with whom she's not really permitted to have relations with. Salacha, she becomes a halala. Once she becomes a halala, she is no longer permitted to go ahead and consume truma. However, Rashi says, "Ve'im lo yada mishnasa petzuadaka hare zu ocheles mishni baraka arel." Alma matzina betzua koin daka koin machel b'makom acher hilchach b'chidusha avera nami machil calls vanshla asach halal. So we'll say the point over here is you see a case where a kohen could be a petzuadaka, and yet enable a woman to eat truma. Right? Now I will say it's a very specific case. What's the case of a Petzuadaka? It's an interesting piece of Gemara trivia, right? I will say, what's the case of a Petzuadaka who allows a woman to eat truma? And it's a case of a regular Kohen who married a Bas Yisrael. They're married, she's eating truma. He then becomes a Petzuadaka. If he doesn't have relations with his wife, making her a halala, she continues her license to eat truma. Once he goes in and has relations with her, then Rabbi says she becomes prohibited. Once she becomes a halala. Once that occurs, then ultimately what? Truma becomes prohibited. Rava says, Rava says that halacha l'maisa, she remains permitted to have a truma, no different than quote-unquote anyone else acquired by the Kohen Petzuadaka, like his servants, who are permitted to go ahead and continue to eat truma. Sabai lo amar Rava. Sabai doesn't hold like Rava. Why not? kinyan di ishus mi kinyan di ishus yafinon. Because Rabbi say we learn out cases of marriage from cases of marriage. V'lo yafinon kinyan di ishus mi kinyan da avadim. And you can't learn out, quote unquote, the kinyan of marriage from the kinyan of servants. The Rava lo Amar Abaye. Rava doesn't hold of Abaye. Why not? So shiny hasam, because Rava will say like this. It's different in that case. Why shekvar achla? Rava will say in the case where she was married, and then her husband became b'tzuadaka. That's a different kind of case. Why is that a different kind of case? Because she started out her marriage permitted to go ahead and eat truma. So once you're permitted to go ahead and eat truma, in other words, we'll say once you have the license. So it's much easier to perpetuate that license as opposed to a case where she began the relationship in a state of Isser. Abaye says we don't employ the svara of she's already consumed, right? That once you've started to eat, you're going to continue to eat. Why? Because if you don't say this, basi shani says lekohen umeis. We'll say, let's say a simple case: a wife of a kohen, a white woman is married to a kohen. Regular woman, regular kohen, everything is fine. Then what happens? Rabbi will say, her husband dies. Her husband dies. Rabbi will say, what's talacha if a Bas Yisrael, Bas Yisrael, married to a kohen, husband dies, let's say they have no children. Is she permitted to continue to eat truma? No. But if you were to say a svar of shekvar achla, if you were to subscribe to the svar that, hey, once you started eating truma, you could continue to eat truma, and then she should be permitted to do so as well. The fact that we don't say that indicates to us that we don't say just because you've started to consume truma gives you the license to continue to do so. To which the Gemara says, Rava, Hasam Paka Kinyana, Hachalo Paka Kinyana. Rava will say, no, here's the difference. The difference is that once the kohen husband dies, her relationship to the kahuna has fundamentally ended. And I will say, I want to just be clear. Obviously, we saw in yesterday's daf, we saw this case relatively quickly. If she has a child with the kohen, remember again, that child is her license to continue to eat truma. But if there's no child, then once her husband dies, the Gemara uses lashon paka kinyana. Literally, again, her connection to the kahuna is gone. Hacha lo paka kinyana. Good. So I will say, so again, just to kind of keep our eye on the case over here. Remember again, we started off with the mission on a very specific case. That essentially, what happens if you have a Bas Kohen, right? You have a Bas Kohen who goes ahead and has kiddushin with a Kohen Gadol, right? Let's see, she's an almana, she has kiddush with a Kohen Gadol. So we're focused on one very specific thing: legal or illegal marriage. Which one? Illegal. So what are we focused on? Now, during Kiddushin, before there was a Bia Asur, prohibited Bia, is she precluded from eating Truma? Now, again, I will say, where would she be eating Truma from in this case? Her father's home, right? Not the husband, because remember, that's what we're talking about, a very specific case of a Bas Kohen, Bas Kohen Amana, who becomes betrothed to the Kohen Gadol. So she's got access to Truma from her father's home. Can she continue to eat that truma during this period of illegal kiddushin or not? So that's the machlokes. Rabbi Meir the Tanakama says no. No, why? Because since this kiddushin, the lashon we use is she's mishtameres lebia psula daraisa. She is set up for what is going to be a prohibited bia, biblically prohibited bia, and therefore again we essentially kind of that status devolves upon her even now during Kiddushin, and she can't eat Truma. Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon say, no, the status is only conferred upon her when there's actual Bia, Nisuin. But Lamaisa during Kiddushin, even though this is an illegal Kiddushin, the illegal Kiddushin does not confer upon her a status where she can't eat Truma from her father's home. That's the machlokes. We brought in the case of Petzuadaka because we thought it may be similar, but the Yevamos say, nah, it's not so similar. Okay, so we'll say, let's analyze a bit more. Here we go. Gufa, Barmine, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Oshia. Here we go, we'll say. Petzuadaka Kohen, this is fascinating. Petzuadaka Kohen, Shenisa Bas Gerim. Here we go, we'll say. Kohen who's a Petzuadaka, right? He's already a Petzuadaka. He marries Bas Gerim. Then we're going to see if that's mutter or not. We're assuming right now that it's mutter, right? Why would it be mutter to marry the daughter of a ger? Why? because that's not called Kal Hashem. We're assuming now there's two groups in Klal Yisrael. There's Kal Hashem and there's Kal Gerim. Who's in Kal Hashem? Who's in Kal Hashem? We'll call it Jews from birth. Who's in Kal Gerim? Gerim, right? Gerim, and by the way, not just Gerim, but who else? The offspring of Gerim, right? Now the interesting shaila will be, well, how long do you remain in Kal Gerim, and at which point in time do you transition to Kal Hashem? Okay, we'll discuss. So a Kohen Psuadaka who marries the daughter of a Ger, so the Gemara says, Maush Yachilena B'Truma. So listen to this. So we'll say, so now, assuming that is a legal marriage, halacha l'maisa, is she permitted to eat truma? Can the Bas Gerim, right? Can the Bas Gerim who married the Kohen Psuadaka eat truma? So we'll say, so this Shaila Rabbi Yochanan, that's Rabbi Oshia. Ishtik v'lo amar lei v'lo midi. So Rabbi Oshia didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. He's right. He didn't respond. L'sof asagava rabba achrina by minei milsa. Afterwards, another great Talmud Chacham came along and asked Shaila Rabbi Oshia, upashat lei. Rabbi Oshia answered him, Uman Reish Lakish. Who was the other Talmud Chacham? Was Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yehuda, Nisir Rabbi Oshia. So Rabbi says, listen to this. So what the Gemara is pointing out over here is, Rabbi Oshia answered the question of Reish Lakish, but he did not answer the question of Rabbi Yochanan. And he was silent. So Rabbi Yehuda, Nisir Rabbi Oshia, At Rabbi Yochanan Lav Gavra Rabbi. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Oshia, is Rabbi Yochanan not a great Talmud Chacham that you don't answer his questions? Why didn't you even respond to his question? Amar later, Rabbi Oshia respond, Dekabai minai milsa deles la patri. He asked me a question for which there is no resolution. Rabbi Oshia essentially said, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. So he'll say, so it's interesting. Why didn't Rabbi Oshia just say to Rabbi Yochanan, I don't know the answer? So we'll say, it could very well be that Rabbi Oshia was very careful with his words. And therefore, Rabbi say, essentially, I don't have to tell you I don't know the answer. How will you know that I don't know the answer? How will you know? I just simply don't say anything. If I knew something, I would say something. If I don't say something, it's because I don't know the answer. And I will say, could very well be that Rabbi Oshia is modeling for us the Koved Rosh, the seriousness with which we should take our words, and how careful we have to be not to use words unnecessarily. Rabbi Oshia is saying that maybe if there's a way to communicate things even through nonverbal communication, that's preferable. Use your words sparingly. In other words, Rabbi Oshia, he answers the next petitioner, he answers the next questioner, but again, be careful with the way you use your words. Be careful in the manner in which you use your words. And if something doesn't need to be said, then what? What? Don't say it. Don't say it. Perhaps. So the Gemara says, Laman. So we'll say, so Rabbi Oshia therefore says, Rabbi Oshia says, this kasha of whether or not a Kohen Psuadaka who marries Bas Gerim, does he allow this wife to eat truma or not? Apparently Rabbi Oshia felt that this was a shayla that does not have an answer. So says, well, let's analyze this a little bit. So Laman, through whose lens should we look at this? Rabbi Yehuda, right? If it's going to Rabbi Yehuda, bein b'kedusha sekai, bein la b'kedusha sekai, lo achla. So we'll say, now listen to this. So we'll say, if you think about it, by the way, this shayla has really two different components to it, right? What are the two components? Number one component is, does a Kohen Psuadaka retain his residual Kedushas Kahuna? Right? That's issue number one. Because we'll say, in order to enable someone to eat Truma, you yourself have to be a Kohen. So issue number one is, does a Kohen Psuadaka retain his residual Kedushas Kahuna? What's question number two? Is he permitted to marry Bas Gerim? Right? That's so two questions over here. So the Gemara says, listen to this. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Bein b'kedusha saikai. Rabbi say, if you look at Rashi, Bein b'kedusha saikai, the kaman, the paraka arel mi boilan koin b'tzuadaka mal b'gyores b'kedusha saikai v'acha bein b'kedusha say. So this is a shayla the Gemara is going to talk about later on. Daf Ayin Vav, a few weeks from now. Right? Does the koin b'tzuadaka retain his residual kedushas kunas? Listen to this. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, Bein b'kedusha saikai, bein la b'kedusha saikai lo achla. According to Rabbi Yehuda, whether the Kohen retains his residual kuna or doesn't, either way, he would not permit this woman to eat truma. Why not? the Amar Mar Bas Ger Zachar Ki Bas Chalal Zachar. Because Rabbi say he holds that what? The daughter of a ger, the daughter of a male convert, is just like the daughter of a chalal. Therefore, even if he has his residual kahuna, he's not allowed to marry this woman. Ilav bikidusha sekai, and if the kohen petzuadaka doesn't retain his residual kahuna, lo achla, she also doesn't eat truma. Why not? Do amrinan kal gerin ikre kal. Wow. Because I say we hold that the congregation of gerim is still called kal Hashem, and therefore he can't marry her. So we'll say, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, either way, a kohen petzuadaka does not enable his wife, this wife, baskerim, to go ahead and eat truma. Either Rabbi Yossi, and if you hold according to Rabbi Yossi, bein bikidusha sekai, bein lav bikidusha sekai. So ultimately, according to Rabbi Yossi, whether you say a kohen petzuadaka retains his residual kuna or not, achla. Ultimately, again, if he marries a bas gerim, she's permitted to eat. How so? Bikidusha say ka'achla. If a kohen petzuadaka retains his residual kahuna, so his wife is permitted to eat truma. Why? Deha amar af ger shenasar giores bito ksheir lakuna. Because we say he holds that halacha lemaisa. Even if a ger marries a giores, their offspring is permitted to the kahuna. In which case halacha lemaisa she could eat truma. And ultimately, if you hold that a kohen petzuadaka does not retain his residual kahuna, then ultimately, again, achla, she is still permitted to eat truma. Why? Daha amar kal gerim lo ikri kal. That the kal of gerim, so we'll say, if a kohen petzuadaka does not retain his residual kahuna, and therefore what? He's effectively not a kohen, but what is he still? He's still a petzuadaka. A petzuadaka can't marry into kal Hashem, but this opinion knows that kal gerim is not called kal Hashem. So the Gemara is asking, Rabbi Shia, I don't understand, what's your problem? Right? Why couldn't you answer the question? In other words, there is an answer. There is an answer to this question. It just depends on which position you want to align yourself with. Ella aliba da haitana. So we'll say what Rabbi Shia was concerned about was the following Tana. Listen to this. Here we go. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Isha baskerim lo tinasi lekahuna, ad shete ima mi Yisrael. So we'll say, listen to this. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, the daughter, right? Isha baskerim, a girl who is the daughter of Gerim, cannot marry into the kahuna until her mother is a Jew. Her mother has to be a Jew. If you look at Rashi, we'll say, no, not yet. So the Gemara says, Valchami Baile. So we'll say, this was the Shaila. So the Gemara says, Valchami Baile. Kashrus mitos svaba va'achla, o dilma kidusha mitos svaba v'lo achla. Now we'll say, here's the Shaila. What exactly does it do to have a Jewish mother? Right? In this case, what exactly is the impact ultimately again in having a Jewish mother? Does it add to kashrus or does it add to kedusha? Now, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Kashrus itol siba v'ro'uya l'kuhuna v'lav kedusha lakre kal umuteres l'ptzuadaka v'ochalas mimanafsha. So we'll say, do we say that halacha l'maisa, having a Jewish mother, essentially gives her a status of kashrus, that halacha l'maisa, she is permitted to go ahead and marry into the kahuna. But again, look at Rashi. V'ru'ya l'kahuna, v'lav kidusha lakre kal umuteres l'psuadaka v'ochalis manashach. So we'll say, do we say having a Jewish mother essentially makes you fit to ultimately marry into the Jewish people, but it doesn't call you kal Hashem. So ultimately, again, which means she should be permitted to go ahead and marry a psuadaka. Odzama, or perhaps Kiddusha mitos svaba, it adds Kiddusha. That maybe if your mother is Jewish, halacha l'maisa, let's say your father's a ger, what that does ultimately is what? What that does is it adds Kiddushas Yisrael, and that you're literally called Kal Hashem. Look at Rashi. Odilma Kiddusha nami tosava ukahalikri. Now, if she's called Kal Hashem, that's wonderful for her. But who can she marry? The Petzuadaka. To which the Gemara says, Tashma, let's analyze this. Ki asa Rabbi Acha bar Chinina midroma. Rabbi Acha bar Chinina came from the south of Eretz Yisrael. Asa va'aisi masnisin biyadei. He came and he brought a Mishnah in his hands. And what was the Mishnah? Minayin lepetzuadaka kohen shena sabas gerim shemachi lebetruma. How do we know that if a Kohen Petzuadaka marries the daughter of Gerim, that he enables her to eat Truma? Shene'emar, the Kohen ki yikne nefesh kinyan kaspo yochal bo. If the Kohen acquires someone through a monetary means, kinyan kaspo, through a kinyan kasef, that person is permitted to go and eat Truma. So this is interesting. So therefore, again, the Gemara says that if a Kohen marries a Bas Gerim, is there a kinyan kaspo in marriage? And the answer is yes. What is that called? It's called Kiddushin. Kiddushin, right? Kesef Kiddushin. So therefore, you see from here that Allah Lamaisa, that a Kohen Petzuadako marries a Bas Gerim is permitted to go ahead. She permits her to eat Truma. So you one saying, Laman, which opinion is according to? Laman, Ilim Rabbi Yehuda, if it's according to Rabbi Yehuda, Hamar Bein Bikdusha Seikai, Bein La Bikdusha Seikai, Lo Achla. But we said, according to Rabbi Yehuda, either way, a Petzuadaka Kohen is not going to enable his wife to eat Truma. If Rabbi Yossi, Lama Lekran, according to Rabbi Yossi, why do I even need the pasuk? Ka'amar, Bein Bikdusha Seikai, Bein La Bikdusha Seikai, Kachla. But according to Rabbi Yossi, either way, he enables her to eat. I don't need the pasuk. Elav Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rather, I will say it must be according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, this third Tana, Ushmamina, Kashrus itosvaba va'achla shmamina. And it must be that ultimately, again, when she is born to a Jewish mother, what that does is it endows her with a sense of kashrus, meaning that it makes her fit to ultimately marry into Klal Yisrael, but it does not call her Kal Hashem. She still remains Kal Gerim, and therefore halacha lamaisa, she would be permitted to go ahead and marry a Kohen Petzuadaka. And if you're permitted to marry a Kohen Petzuadaka, then what? Then halacha lamaisa, you are allowed to eat truma. So I both say it's very interesting over here. So I just want to point out what seems to be coming out over here is that halacha lamaisa is a situation of just here's what's floating, what we don't know yet. What we don't know yet is what is the status of a Kohen Petzuadaka, right? Does the Kohen Petzuadaka, does he retain his residual Kedushas Kahuna or not? So I would say that's issue number one. Issue number two, the daughter of Gerim. Is she called Kal Hashem or not? And I will say the interface between these two issues is quite fascinating, because if you hold that a Kohen Petzuadaka retains his residual Kahuna, and the daughter of Gerim is not called Kal Hashem, but called Kal Gerim, so I will say that creates something very interesting, which is that potentially a Kohen Petzuadaka could marry a Bas Gerim and what? Enable her to eat Truma. But there's a lot of variables in those cases. But where the Gemara seems to be coming out over here, that would be a legal marriage, and actually be a legal marriage that results in Truma consumption. Again, we'll see what the halacha l'may says. More tomorrow in tomorrow's sugya. Se Itmar, let's go weiter. Itmar, Rav Amar, we'll say fascinating sugya now. Rav Amar, so I will say, and by the way, the third issue of what we do, I will say, in a case of illegal kiddushin, right? Because remember, go back to the Mishnah. What was the Mishnah's case? Kohen Gadol did kiddushin with who? With who? An almana. But remember, there's no regular almana. Who is this almana? She's also what? A Bas Kohen. So she's got truma from her father's home. Remember, the issue lurking in the background of Osai is what? Does illegal kiddushin preclude a Bas Kohen from eating truma from her father's home? Or stated otherwise, does a woman who is mishtameres lebia psula, is she precluded from eating truma? That's the machlokes in the Mishnah. We haven't resolved that either. So a lot of exciting stuff kind of hanging in the balance over here. So let's go back to we'll say let's throw another thing into the mix. Itmar, this is great. Rav says, here we go. Amud Beis. This is such a great Amud Beis. Love this type of daf. Right? So listen to this. Yesh chopol psula. So we'll say, here we go. Fascinating sugi now. So Rav says, Yesh chuppah lepsula. So I will say, what does that mean? There's a chuppah for psulas. Look at Rashi. Yesh chuppah lepsula. Taf Rashi nun zayin on base 57b. Kohen Gadol shehechnis amana bas kohen lechuppah v'lo ba'aleha umeikara nami lo kitsha afilu hachi pasla mitruma debeinasha the chuppah kekenisas bi'ila damya. I will say, listen to this. Let's say the Kohen Gadol took this almana, took this Amada, right? And this Almana, this widow, is also the daughter of a Kohen. And what happened? He brought her under the chuppah. Then I will say, we're not going to get into this now, but just understand, there's a whole machlokes. What is the definition of chuppah? Right? Is chuppah what we call chuppah? Standing under a canopy, which is supposed to represent the home of the chassan. Is chuppah potentially yichud, right? So we'll say, let's just go right now with chuppah means chuppah. Let's keep it easy, right? So we'll say, here's the case. Kohen Gadol took the almana under the chuppah, right? Took the almana under the chuppah. Rabbi say there was no kiddushin, nothing else. Took her under the chuppah. So Rav says chuppah essentially is like marriage. He calls it kiknisas bi'ila. It's like the beginning of bia, and therefore again, once the Kohen Gadol brings this almana into the chuppah, she is prohibited to eat truma. Incredible. Shmuel says, in chuppah psulos. Shmuel says, no. There is no chuppah for psulos. In other words, if you're having a legal marriage, bringing her into a chuppah does not affect any level of marriage. And therefore, halacha lemaisa, technically, sounds according to Shmuel, she would still be permitted to go ahead and what? Consume truma. Amar Shmuel says, umodali Abba. I will say Abba is a reference to Rav. Rashi says, why does Shmuel call Rav Abba? Rashi says, modali Abba, mishum dekashish minei karile Abba. Since Rav was older than Shmuel, Shmuel called Rav Abba, right? And Rav would agree with me, modali Abba, betinokes pechusa mibas shalosh shana v'yom echad. And even Rav would agree with me that if the Kohen, right, the Kohen Gadol, were to try, or let's say any man were to try to marry a girl who is less than 3 years old in one day, the Rebbe say, we'll discuss about marriage with a girl so young, 3 years old in one day, hoil ve'ein la bia, ein la chuppah. Since bia with a girl less than 3 years old in one day is not halachically recognized bia, therefore again there's no chuppah. So Rebbe say, this is incredible. According to Rav, the concept of chuppah affecting marriage is because chuppah is, like Rashi said, what do we call chuppah? Tchilas bia. It's the beginning of bia. It's the beginning of bia. So therefore Shmuel says, by the way, Rav would agree with me that you could only hold that chuppah's tchilas bia when bia is possible. But if bia is not possible, when is bia not possible? For example, in a girl that's less than 3 years old in one day, where that is not a halachically recognized bia, even Rav would agree that chuppah doesn't do anything. So Amar Rava said, Af anan nami tanina. We also learned this. Af anan nami tanina. Bas shaloshon v'yom echad miskadeshes bebia. But say if you have a girl who is 3 years old in one day, she's miskadeshes bebia. And I both say how to reconcile that Chazal are talking about bia with a girl who's 3 years old and one day. Like we'll talk about that more in tomorrow's daf. Let's say, but right now, let's just look at the technicalities of it without getting into the feelings of it. So both say, so listen to this Bryce. It says a girl who's 3 years old in one day, miskadeshes bebia, ultimately again could become betrothed through bia. Ve'imba aleha yavam kina. Similarly again, they will say other examples of this. If the yavam had relations with her, ultimately it affects yibum. V'chayavan aleh mishum eishes ish. And I will say if she's married, she's a married woman. If someone else were to have relations with her, ultimately again she would be eishes ish. Umitames bo'ala letame mishkav tachton ke'elyon. And I will say, technically speaking, Rashi says over here, umitame es bo'ala im nidahi. So I will say again, how a 3-year-old girl, three years old, could become. We're not going to get into it right now, but the point over here is, should she become tameh? Ultimately, again, she could convey that tumah to any man who has relations with her. Nisis lekohen, if she marries a kohen, ocheles betruma. Ultimately, again, she's permitted to go ahead and eat truma. Ba'ala echad mikala psulin, and ultimately, again, if halacha lemaisa, any man who is pasul ultimately goes ahead and, if any man who is pasul, Ba'ala echad psulin, if any of the men who are psulin have relations, so Rashi, look at Rashi, mina psulin, higon chalal, nosin, mamzer, or almana lekohen gadol. So if any person who is a pasul has relations with her, then pasla. Ultimately, again, they invalidate her from marrying a Kohen. What is here about saying? It is only a girl who is 3 years old in one day who becomes psula through bia. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, just skipped. Bas shalosh shana v'yom echad hu demifsala b'bia, mifsala b'chuppah. So Rabbi say it is only a girl who is 3 years old in one day who becomes invalidated through bia, who could also become invalidated through chuppah. Otherwise, Rabbi say. So again, just to be clear, so this is a backup to Shmuel. Remember again, Rabbi say, what's the question we're dealing with over here? If a man takes a woman who he's not allowed to marry, so again, let's take the case we saw before, right? Halacha l'maisa, Kohen Gadol is marrying an almana. Kohen Gadol is marrying an almana, right? Illegal marriage. He takes her under the chuppah. What does that do? So Rav said, what does that do? It's tchilas bia, and tchilas bia therefore says, assuming this almana is also a bas Kohen, she can no longer eat truma. Shmuel says no. Chuppah does not affect marriage. Ein chuppah lepsulos. Chuppah does not affect anything with apostle, and therefore she can still continue to eat truma. Shmuel is coming along and saying, by the way, even according to Rav, who says that chuppah is tchilas bia, if chuppah is tchilas bia, then what does that tell us, Rabbi Osai? Chuppah only affects something when there's a bia, when there's the potential for bia. Rabbi say, but where there is no potential for bia, even Rav will agree that chuppah doesn't affect anything. All Shmuel is putting, Rabbi say, is and when does a possible bia begin? Only when? From 3 years old and 1 day. It is only the bia from 3 years old and 1 day that is a halachically recognized bia, and it's only from that point forward that chuppah would have any kind of ramification. But with a girl less than 3 years old in 1 day, hapachusa mibas shalosh shana v'yom echad, de lo mifsala bebia, lo mifsala nami b'chuppah. Less than 3 years old in 1 day, where there is no bia, would also not become invalidated with chuppah zah. So say, what that means is that technically speaking, if a Kohen were to go ahead, and we're going to see the statement's a little bit academic, because halacha l'maisa, we would assume that if there's no bia less than 3 years old in 1 day, then there's also what? There's no chuppah less than 3 years old in 1 day. But the Gemara never says, Shema Mina, indeed see that Shmuel's assertion is correct. And therefore, Abosai, so again, we're going to stop over here for today, but I just want to point out kind of what we have still floating around, right? Number one is the machlokes in the Mishnah. We haven't resolved it. Abosai, does illegal kiddushin preclude a woman from eating truma or not? The bas Kohen from eating truma? Again, machlokes Rabbi Meir on one side, Rabbi Shimon on the other side. That's issue number one. Issue number two, Abosai, is what? Petzua daka Kohen. What's the question? Does he retain residual kedusha or not? Machlokes. Issue number three, the daughter of Gerim, right? Is she called Kal Hashem, Kal Gerim? Still outstanding. Machlokes number four, if a Kohen Gadol does chuppah within a legal marriage, he does chuppah with an almana, does that chuppah, assuming the almana is a bas Kohen, does that chuppah prevent her from eating truma or not? Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav says yes. Shmuel says it's so very exciting day. And it's only Tuesday. 4 machloksim that we still haven't resolved. Emir Hashem will see the resolution to all 4 b'shatom mislachos in tomorrow's daf. Shkoyach.